Hello, my name is Marina Azzimonti, and I am one of the co-editors of the Economic Dynamics newsletter. This is our first live interview, and I am very excited to welcome Veronica Guerrieri to be our first guest. Veronica Guerrieri is the Ronald Tarson Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. She graduated in 2006 from MIT, where she worked with Daron Acemoglu and Ivan Berning, and she has had a stellar career ever since. In 2013, she won the Carlo Alberto Medal for Best Italian Economist Under 40. In 2015, she won the Bernasser Award for Best European Economist Under 40. She is a research associate of the NBR, where she is part of the steering committee of the Economic Fluctuations and Growth Group. She is one of the managing editors of the Review of Economic Studies, and she's in the board of editors of the Journal of Economic Literature. Through her career, she organized several conferences, including the 2014 SED meeting, where we were co-directors, and that was a fantastic experience working with her. So it's a very great honor to welcome her. She has been very involved in our society through time. So it's great to have Veronica here.
Thanks a lot, Marina, for inviting me for this first interview, and thanks a lot for the generous introduction.
Okay, so in general, Veronica works on, you probably know her work in macroeconomics. She has made a lot of important contributions in search theory, dynamic contracting, growth, and macroeconomics in general. Now she put her mind to tackle some of the effects of economics of the COVID-19 pandemic. She's trying to help us understand a little bit more how this pandemic has affected the economy, and how can we think of policies that can improve on the allocations that we are seeing. And in her latest work, she has kind of an interesting new theory, because so when we've been trained in neoclassical theory, we tend to think of negative TFP shocks as creating recessions and contractions in output, employment, etc., as being optimal responses to just an economy that is not as productive as it used to be. And this implies certain policies that we want to put in place. Now, on the other hand, we see a lot of people arguing that this is of course a textbook example of a negative productivity shock, but we see a lot of proponents saying that we should be stimulating the economy. So my first question is this just a political stance sort of to redistribute, or is there anything in terms of efficiency that you can, that we can think of, or some real effects of efficiency of the current pandemic?
Yeah, so first of all, let me say that my work on COVID-19 is joint with Guido Lorenzoni, Ludwig Straub, and Ivan Werning. And this question is very well posed, because our first and main point is that when we think about the pandemic and how to model the pandemic in a macro model, to think in terms of standard supply versus demand shocks is probably too simplistic. And why is that? Well, because demand and supply are always interlinked, but this connection becomes particularly important when we think about a shock like COVID-19. And this is because we think that the defining feature of the pandemic is really its asymmetric nature. And so the endogenous nature of the demand becomes particularly important. Well, when we think about the COVID-19, we think that he hits some sectors directly, and in particular, those sectors that requires more personal interactions, like restaurants or gyms, for example, while it does not hit directly other sectors that do not require contact for trading goods. For example, think about online shopping or other online services. It's true that these sectors may still be affected by COVID-19, but only in indirect way. And then the interesting question becomes when COVID-19 hits some sectors directly as a supply shock, as a standard supply shock, in the sense that it reduces the efficient level of economic activity in those sectors. Is it possible that it propagates to the other sectors in the economy and to the rest of the economy, generating shortages in demand that generates inefficient employment losses? And our answer is yes. Once we consider a multi-sector model, and in particular, when we introduce complete markets, it's possible that COVID-19 is a shock, that a supply shock in hitting some sector, but it generates demand shortages in other. And we call this a Keynesian supply shock, when demand shortages dominate the original effect of the supply shock.
So are you thinking in terms of externalities from one sector to another? Can you tell us a little bit more about the mechanism?
So think about a two-sector economy. One sector is sector A, is the sector that is highly contact intense. It generates a lot of personal interaction. And sector B is a sector that does not require personal interaction. This is before the pandemic. There are workers in sector A, workers in sector B. They get income from their sector and they spend in both sectors. Now, what happens when we have a pandemic? So the way in which we represent a pandemic in this model is just thinking about a reduction in the efficient level of economic activity in sector A. You can think about it as a full lockdown. Sectors that require personal interaction just cannot operate. Or you can think about that this reduction in economic activity derived from directly the fact that people are scared to go back to the restaurants or to work in restaurants because they're scared to get infected. Either way, the level of economic activity in those sectors that require personal interaction goes down, and this is an efficient drop in output. However, the question is, and let's assume that this shock is extreme, so sector A completely shuts down. Now, the question that we are asking is what happens in sector B? So what happens to the demand for goods produced in sector B? And the first, let's just consider an economy with complete market. If markets are complete, it's why it could be that there are demand shortages in sector B. Well, this can arise, so this shock can be a Keynesian supply shock when there is enough complementarity between the goods produced in sector B and sector A. Again, think about sector A as restaurants. There may be sectors in the economy that are gonna see an increase in demand. For example, think about takeout food or grocery store, because these are sectors that are best substituted with restaurants. There are other sectors, think about buying fancy clothes online, that are going to instead see a drop in demand because actually people prefer not to buy, so they don't need to buy much clothes if they're not going to go out for restaurants. And so the question is, if complementarity, the degree of complementarity across sectors dominates or is high enough, then it may be that the overall demand in sector B goes down. Okay, and this graph here, in this graph, you can see the parameter space, the purple shaded area, where actually Keynesian supply shocks arise, which is a situation where the elasticity of substitution between goods, epsilon, is slow enough relative to the elasticity of intertemporal substitution. And why is that? Well, because on the one hand, you want to demand more goods in sector B if they're good substitute. But on the other hand, well, you may prefer overall to wait for tomorrow to consume when the pandemic is going to be over, and you can actually spend also in those sectors that today are closed. Now, so the first ingredient that is important to think about Keynesian supply shock is complementarity across sectors. The second ingredient that is important is incomplete markets. So when markets are incomplete, if we have a multi-sector model, actually the parameter space where Keynesian supply shock arises becomes larger. And why is that? Well, before we could have transfers potentially between sector A workers, sector B workers, but now these transfers are gone. And let's consider an extreme case where actually sector A workers cannot borrow at all. Now they don't even have income, they cannot borrow, they cannot spend in sector B. So there's going to be a drop in demand in sector B beyond the drop coming from the degree of complementarities between the goods produced in sector B and sector A, coming from the fact simply workers in sector A, even though they would like to consume, they cannot because they don't have the income. Okay, and you can see here that the space becomes larger. Let me say, it's important to say that in order for incomplete markets to generate this Keynesian supply shock, you need multiple sectors. With one sector model, incomplete market.
So you use the word Keynesian shock here, so I have to ask you the following follow-up. So should we be paying people to dig holes in the ground and fill them up? Should we go back to Keynesian theories as a way to stimulate this economy if sector A workers are the ones that lost their income?
So in our model, if we think that as we do that the COVID-19 is a Keynesian supply shock, shortage in demand dominates. So any standard expansionary policy that stimulates demand is beneficial. However, let me say that standard government spending is not as effective when the shock is asymmetric, like a pandemic, as in standard models where the shock is a standard aggregate symmetric shock that hits the economy in the same way. And why is that? Well, because government spending are not going to be able to reach those workers that work in sectors where actually the level of economic activity is going down anyway. And so because government spending are not going to be in restaurants, and the restaurant workers are the ones that actually would need the income. And so although government spending is good to increase the level of economic activity by stimulating demand, is not good in terms of improving on the social insurance element that is particularly important when the shock is asymmetric and hit some households more heavily than others.
So basically you're saying we should do some targeting spending like unemployment insurance or send check to household. So there have been in Congress discussions, so they've approved the CARES Act. More recently, there's been discussions about how to approve a HEROES Act. And they all have different things, like you either send checks to households, you give more unemployment insurance, you extend credit to small firms, which would be the ones that would hire sector A workers. So do these make any sense? Can you think them on the lens of this model?
Yes, absolutely. So under the lens of our model, targeted transfers are exactly the best policy. And because they don't only achieve an increase in demand and so an increase in economic activity, but also improve on social insurance. CARES Act and HEROES Act actually embed elements that are totally in line with the idea of targeted transfers. So we think that those are good policies, and they may be in the form of extended unemployment insurance or support to specific businesses in the targeted sectors or PPP and support. And these are all policies that are beneficial. And in fact, there are data, in real-time data, that show that CARES Act has been effective. So let me show you a slide about this. From a paper by Raj Chetty and co-authors, and there is similar figures in a paper by Natalie Cox and co-authors. I use microdata on spending to see how effective the CARES Act has been, and as well as what are the effects of the pandemic. And you can see here the blue line is a low income, the spending of low income households in the bottom quartile of the income distribution, and the green line is spending of the households in the top quartile of the distribution. And the dashed line here has been the CARES Act, the moment in which CARES Act has been introduced. And here we have the beginning of the pandemic. So you can see that there has been a drop in spending that is larger for rich households. And this is because those households have been the ones that traditionally spend more in those services like going to the restaurants, going to the gym, that are typically luxury goods. That said, there are other important papers on labor markets that show instead that the income of the poor households has been the one that has been hit the most, because those are the workers that work in those sectors. But what is interesting here is that after the CARES Act has been introduced, that there is an increase in spending for both, but particularly so for the poor households, who are the ones that are typically mostly targeted by this policy.
And more constrained also, probably.
So I interpret this as a success of the CARES Act. Now, it would be good to see going forward more real-time data. There is some new work from some new figures from Natalie Cox and co-author that show that after the end of July, there has been a drop in spending of those households that used to get the transfers, of course. And
so I have another question. So the graph you showed us, which was very nice to understand the intuition of the model, is very horizontal. So it looks like sector A and B are kind of complementary in consumption, but another thing that we've observed in this recession is that the supply chains got a little bit messed up because of COVID-19. So do you have any sense of what happens to linkages when some sectors are inputs of other sectors?
Absolutely. So let me go back to the figure I showed you at the beginning. Let me share that. So far, I've been talking only of complementarities across sectors in terms of preferences. Okay, if the goods is a substitute, a good substitute or complements according to preferences for consumption. But of course, there are important linkages across sectors that may be due to input-output linkages. And in a way, if you want to think about the mechanism I described before, input-output linkages are going to serve in a similar fashion by increasing the complementarity between the sectors. They're going to actually increase the parameter space where occasional supply shock can arise. So think about, but it's important to say that the input-output linkages that we're thinking about, so the supply chains that we are thinking about, that are going to be important for this transmission of demand shortages, are supply chains that travel from downstream to upstream, meaning the sectors that are hit directly by the shock were demanding inputs from the sectors that are not hit by the shock directly. And so they're going to generate a further drop in demand in those sectors, even though it would be not efficient to have that. There is another way of thinking about supply chains that people have been more talking about, especially back in February when the pandemic hit first China and not the US. So there was a lot of talking about disruption in supply chain because of the lack of intermediate goods coming from China for US firms when the pandemic did not hit yet the US. And of course, these are also important. These are supply chains that travel from upstream to downstream. These are also important type of chains. But we think that it's important to think about these other directions to think about possible inefficiency in demand. And there is a beautiful paper that I highly recommend you to read by Baquet and Emmanuel Fari that actually have a much richer setting of supply chain where you can think about both downstreams to upstream, upstreams to downstream, and have much richer implications. So I really encourage you to read that.
Thank you. Now, another thing that has been discussed a lot is the Fed, right? So the Fed has kept interest rates low, and there's been a lot of discussion of what's the role, if any, of the Fed in trying to ameliorate the macroeconomic consequences of the pandemic. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, so conventional monetary policy is in our model, in our reading, is not very dissimilar from government spending in a sense that it's gonna help in stimulating demand as it traditionally does. And so it helps in an economy where there are demand shortages, but is not gonna help for social insurance. So it's not also gonna reach those workers in those sectors that are mostly hit by the pandemic. Now, if we think more broadly about monetary policy, I think there is still some benefit from monetary policy on top of the standard stimulating demand coming from the fact that monetary policy typically lengthen the horizon of businesses, so make them think more about the long run. And this may help avoiding some business exit and some firing and job distractions that can potentially help in the medium run. And so in this respect, probably more unconventional monetary policy like liquidity provisions and so forth are going to be more effective and help possibly in the recovery. And in general, let me say one thing I forgot to say before about also fiscal policy or linked to monetary policy as well. So there is a discussion about, I think a relevant discussion to be done about is it beneficial to incentivize labor hoarding. So in a world where we think that job destruction, it's costly and it's gonna possibly make the recovery slower, is incentivizing labor hoarding a good thing or not? And it turns out that some policy in that, vaguely in that, like PPP, for example, However, we have seen that it has not been as successful as expected, because the businesses that have been helped the most probably were not the ones that were more in trouble. But in Europe, for example, in Germany, in Italy, there are more structured policies in this direction. And I think it's an open question whether these policies may actually be more helpful going forward for the recovery. At the same time, they're going to help now because they're going to, it's a different way of providing social insurance and incentive and reaching those workers that otherwise would lose their income.
I guess it depends a little bit on the horizon of the pandemic, right? Because if it's too long and then it means a lot of restructuring needs to happen and reallocation, I don't know how much you want to push.
Yeah, so it's true. There is an interesting debate here. I mean, there is a lot of structural transformation of the economy that potentially people have been talking about potentially is going to last beyond the pandemic because of all these new learning about working online and so forth. The possibility
we are doing this online after all.
They're doing this online. I'm not sure though people do things online as much. So probably I can see some of the lighting to survive, but a lot of personal interaction to come back. But anyway, even though we believe that there is going to be a structural transformation in the long run, I think that still the problem is that the depth of the recession, of course, is very big right now. And there is also the problem that you can have the business cascade. So if some business exit, then this reduces demand for other businesses, then these are not going to make it, they're going to exit as well and so forth. So there are like these kind of chains that are very worrisome. And so in my view, it's always better to do restructure, like creative destruction, and when we are in expansion, and there is work that actually show that it's more effective to do creative destruction in expansion rather than in recession, and in particular in a recession that is so deep as this one. The problem is also that if you have shortage in demand, you're going to have shortage in demand also for those businesses that you would like to create. And so the problem is that if there is an efficient low demand, then this is not going to help not even the creation of good businesses in the sectors that you would like. And so this is why I believe now is really a moment where to think more about the short run and medium run. Of course, I mean, you want to cut back this policy not too far in the future. I mean, soon enough to avoid to sclerotize the economy. But I think
that was going to be my next question. I mean, all these policies are great. They provide insurance. They keep businesses floating. They give people checks. They are expensive. And of course, we know you don't want to increase taxes in bad times. You want to borrow. But should we be worried somehow about the staggering size of the deficit and the stock of debt that the US and the world as a whole is accumulating? Aren't we in a trap? Aren't we falling in a trap by everybody borrowing so much now?
So of course, this is a big issue, and the debt, US debt is growing, and then deficits are large, and we should be concerned about that. But once again, I think this is a really deep recession. People are suffering, there are lots of job losses on top of the health cost and so forth. So I think that this is probably not the moment to worry too much about the accumulation of debt. And I think it is a good time instead to remind policymakers that it is important to build up fiscal space, but you really want to do that during expansion, not to wait for a shock to hit to do that. And so fiscal space is very important, and we can see that from heterogeneous responses of different countries across the world, because Latin American countries, for example, with much tighter hands, they cannot really do that. They cannot do as much fiscal stimulus as we can still probably do. But again, I think that right now
it's not
worry too much about that. We should do that soon, but not now. Yeah.
So now my last question. So our audience is pretty young. A lot of new assistant professors, PhD students are part of the people that typically go to SED conferences. So imagine you're one of them, or imagine I'm one of them, and you would want to give me advice on what are lines of research. So for example, should we be thinking about investing time in understanding more this recession if you're a young scholar? What are the next steps you would do if you were interested? Where are the nice, interesting, promising research areas? Do you have any advice for a young researcher?
Yeah, so first of all, I think that we are now living in a unique historical moment. And so it is great that there has been so many economists, young and old, thinking about COVID-19 and thinking about possible policy to help. It is important both in terms of understanding what's happening, which is always a good lesson for the future. Hopefully not, but it could be. And it is important for a policymaker to make a more informed decision and better decision in a moment in which it's particularly important to be timely. That said, and I think that we have always, hopefully, the pandemic is going to end soon, and we have always to keep in mind that research has to be broad because many different type of shock can always hit the economy, and we want to be prepared to be able to think about different aspects of the economy. So I think it's important to think more broadly and about different issues and the issues that you assistant professors or young scholars are interested in, because all the parts of the economy are interconnected and they're always important to have the broad picture of the economy. There are things about the pandemic and about understanding the pandemic that I think are going to be more long lasting. And so you want to maybe think about what we learn from the pandemic, and that is going to be helpful to think forward also about different situations. And for example, from the Great Recession, we learned that heterogeneous agents model are particularly important if we want to think about balance sheets. And I think from this recession, what we are learning is that multiple sector interactions are very important. And so that also pushed the frontier in terms of thinking about policy in that direction, about the positive effect of the economy of different shocks in that direction.
Okay, thank you very much for discussing with us, and hope to see you in our conference soon.
Thank you. Thanks, Marina.
Bye-bye.